Good evening, everybody. My name is Jeffrey Katz, and I'm the president of the Washington Map Society. And again, as in the past, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, or this evening's program, depending on where you are, which is hosted by a partnership of 8 map societies representing all parts of the country: the Boston, California, Chicago, New York, Rocky Mountain, Texas, and Washington Map Societies, as well as the Library of Congress's Phillips Lee Phillips Society. These map societies are nonprofit organizations that support map collecting, cartography, and the study of cartographic history. These groups also supply financial support for this Zoom meeting. If you are not a member, we hope you will consider joining at least one map society. Please see the chat for links to each of the map societies. They're all there. The benefits vary for each society, and for example, to take our own, members of the Washington Map Society receive 3 annual issues of the Portalon Journal, digital access to all past issues of the Portalon, digital access to past guest speaker lectures, and many other features in the member-only section of our website. And if you're not a member yet, the WMS has an introductory rate of $25 for the first year of digital membership. Now, one program that we have at the Washington Map Society that I'd like to underscore now is our annual Ristow Prize for full or part-time undergraduate, graduate, and first-year postdocs. The prize is $1,000, and the winning essay is published prominently in our journal. The deadline for submission this year is June 1st. Now, it's quite a boon for budding scholars. So if you know anyone who might be interested, all of the necessary information is on our website. Now, we in our partner map societies would also like to thank our advertisers who support our groups and also make possible the publication of our journals, the Portalon and the Calafia, the Journal of the California Map Society. And before we proceed further with tonight's program, there are a few standard requests. Please note that this lecture will be recorded, so please turn off your video and microphone if you do not want to be recorded. Please use the chat feature to type questions, and they'll be addressed at the conclusion of the talk. And after the Q&A period, as usual, we'll leave the meeting open for attendees to socialize if they wish, at which point you may turn your microphone on. And now I turn the program over to Ron Grimm, the WMS Vice President and Program Chair. Ron?
Okay, before we start introductions of the speakers, I'd like to share some news from Boston. If in case you haven't heard, the Boston Map Society has folded, and a number of their members have decided to take memberships with the Washington Map Society. Pictured here was a day late in September when David Cobb and his partner Kara Summerlin came to DC. We went to a local bar and had some beers so that we could reminisce about the good old days in Boston. But we look forward to having the Boston folks with us in the Washington Map Society and hope that they can help make contributions to our programs. The 8 partnerships that you saw listed, the 8 map societies, the program chairs have assisted me in developing a program schedule, and that schedule is now complete through June. The program schedule will be listed in the forthcoming issue of the Portalon, which is coming out in another week or 2. And I have shared that list with the other map societies, and you will see it on our website as well. Our next event will be February 10th on Zoom, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Our speaker is Barbara Bellier, Professor Emerita of English at the University of Calgary in Alberta. And she will be talking about papering the landscapes, maps of regime change in North America. Now, she will focus on a map set that pertains to Lake Athabasca in northern Alberta and Saskatchewan, done in the late 19th century. But she warns us that this was not the first time that that area was mapped. And I hope you will join us so you can find out about some of the prior mapping of that area. Now I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. The speaker is Benjamin Olshin. He's the retired professor of philosophy, history, and philosophy of science and technology design at the University of Arts in Philadelphia. Some of you may know him through a book he published in 2014 through the University of Chicago Press. It was about the mapping related to Marco Polo's travels to the Far East. And part of that, his research was based on a small collection that's in the Geography and Map Division Library of Congress, known as the Rossi Collection. Ben has traveled extensively around the world in his various career opportunities. But now I'd like to introduce and turn the program over to Ben. He will be talking about indigenous mapping, cultural and psychological sources. And I would like to also indicate that this program was organized in cooperation with the Chicago Map Society, to whom Ben previously has delivered this address. So Ben, I turn the program over to you. And
Okay.
again, I repeat, if you have questions, type them in the chat.
Oh, we lost you. Okay. All right. First of all, I just want to say a couple things. I'd like to thank you guys for inviting me. This talk actually is different, I think, than the talk I gave to the Chicago Map Society, but I have given talks to the Chicago Map Society, which I enjoyed very much. And I thank you for inviting me to give this talk to the Washington Map Society. And also for those of you who are interested in the Marco Polo book, and it seems that more and more people are interested in that. It's undergone a revival recently. I should point out that Ron Grimm was extremely helpful when I was doing my research way back then, because he was at the Library of Congress. So he's responsible and he's thanked explicitly in the book. I also want to make one other brief comment. We were talking about New Jersey. As I will highlight in this talk, I've lived all over the world and been in many exotic places, but I still love the Jersey Shore. And I just want everyone to know that. So we shouldn't be snobs about New Jersey. So, okay, so let me begin my talk. And the way I understand it is that we will have time for questions, and I will try to stick to a pretty strict schedule so that we will have time for questions. And let me just set this up so it's not timed. Okay. All right. Everyone can see okay? Yes. All right. So I'm talking about indigenous mapping, and the title of this talk then has an interesting subtitle, Cultural and Psychological Resources. And I will explain what that is as we go on. And I will give a little background too about why I'm interested in this. I'm interested in many different topics in cartography and beyond. So I'll talk about how I fell into this topic and sort of where I am with this topic. Again, Ron had mentioned that I spoke about this in Chicago, which I don't recall, but I did speak about this in Brazil for the International Conference for the History of Cartography. I spoke about it there, and the research has come a bit further since then. So I want to talk about how I fell into this, because it's not so much about me, but I like when I give a talk to explain why I'm interested in something, why something struck me as interesting. So I had been interested in the history of cartography for a very long time. That was my field of study when I did a master's and PhD at the University of Toronto. I had a wonderful professor named Alexander Jones who wrote the book on the Antikythera mechanism, if you know what that is. And he did Babylonian astronomy, and he got me interested in the history of cartography. And in particular, when I was a graduate student, I was interested in map making in the ancient and medieval European world and the Islamic world. But in particular, I got interested in this idea of a mindset because I'm also a painter and an artist. And when people sit down to render something, they are of a certain frame of mind. And we see that in terms of early map makers too, right? They're thinking in a certain way. And then all that cartography interest was combined with a more general interest in cross-cultural cognitive styles. How do people from different cultures think? I myself am a combination of many cultures. I'm in an intercultural marriage. I've lived all over the world. This photograph here on the right shows me. I'm the guy with the dark blue shirt. And this is when I was in Sri Lanka. I was just 20 years old. And I was on a trip with a group looking at development. And this just really was sort of a shock to me, like how people not only live differently, but think differently. And then I got interested in this idea of how people process space and time differently. And then what's known as cultural and cognitive dissonance, which I live with every day. People of different cultures think differently and talk differently, and there's dissonance, there's conflict. And all of this became wrapped together over many, many years. The drawing below is when I was in Ghana.
You're muted, Ben.
I get muted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you. And so I got interested in this issue of cross-cultural communications from a variety of viewpoints. And so what does it mean to have different cultural styles? Well, it means that in different cultures in one period, so that's called synchronic history, we have different ways of thinking. And then through time, that's called diachronic examination, people also think differently. And you'll see that different cultures or even different historical periods in the same culture, they use different modes and symbols, different metaphors, different representational styles. And there are thousands of examples of this, not just in maps, but in all of art history and culture. And so, for example, in this painting here, this is a still life, which most of us in the modern period look at and we shrug our shoulders. It's a nice painting. But for a person of this period, the late Renaissance, early Enlightenment period, they would look at this and understand every single symbol here, the open book, the fruit, the musical instruments, et cetera. So I really want us as an audience to get in this kind of understanding that we're looking at, what I call an alien world in many ways. If we look at things like cave paintings, we really see an aspect of the human psyche that's very remote to us. Why did people do this? We have no idea. The paintings on the left, it's fascinating. One is from Indonesia and the other is from France. But we see human beings scattered across the globe doing the same things 50,000 years ago, which is chewing up pigment and then spitting it in a spray to make a stencil of their hand. Or we see human beings painting horses, and we don't know why. Were they viewing the horses as deities? Were they doing studies? We don't know what's going on culturally. And then even tens of thousands of years later, we have this famous painting of the lady with the ermine, and that too contains symbolism. It's not just a woman holding a pet. Human beings think in these strange, abstract, symbolic ways, and different cultures do it differently, and we can't always decipher what's going on. And then, of course, since we're in a room filled with map people, we see this in maps, and it's always kind of interesting to look at something like this Babylonian map. It's a very famous map. It's in Terra Incognita and many other publications, and it's an abstract piece of art. It just shows people conceiving their world in a different way, in a way that's kind of alien to us. Or the famous TO maps in the center here. it's strange to us. It's a different cultural style. It's religion combined with factual matter, combined with symbolism, etc. And then even on the far right, my daughter loves this map because I told her, I said, now we're getting into, quote, real mapping. So this is places and there are mountains and there's coastlines. Oh, but oh, look, there's a unicorn in it. And again, we see this style, which is distinctly not modern. It's this different cultural mode, different way of thinking. And these different cultural styles are what I want to begin to focus on. There was a wonderful talk by Professor Leah Thomas. I hope she's here tonight because I found her talk very inspiring. And she showed this very interesting indigenous map. And what's interesting is, why is it different to us? Why is it alien? Why is it strange? It's because it doesn't talk about geographic accuracy. It's not about location. It's about a network of relationships. And that's what the map is showing. And this is interesting. And we still have cognitive styles like this among modern Western thinking. If you look down in the corner there, I have the Washington, D.C. metro map. And that also is not an accurate map in the sense of geographical distance. It's about relationships. So my point is that we as modern Westerners can understand indigenous styles, but they're different, and there's nothing wrong with it being different. And that's part of the fascination. And the question is, why are they different? Where does that come from? And that's what I want to really look at today. So again, here we see this map, and she gave a wonderful talk about this. I guess it was a couple of months ago now, and I found this very inspiring. It's a great example, again, of a different way of looking at the world. And as I think many of you know, particularly if you are politically inclined, this has become very fashionable now, indigenous mapping. There's more resources now, there's a more open cultural perspective. Indigenous mapping has become this kind of hot topic. It's very politically correct. There are conferences on it, there are publications on it, and even the history of cartography devoted a great deal of time and pages to these studies of indigenous maps. It's a good thing, but I think what's necessary is to get down deeper philosophically about what's going on here. And in fact, indigenous maps have interested people for a long time. One of the most famous early works was Bruno Adler in 1910. He wrote a work completely politically incorrectly entitled Maps of Primitive People. But I defend that because it's somebody who is interested in this, and that's what's important. And what's interesting is, again, the mindset of indigenous map makers or indigenous thinkers generally, because it's remote to us. And one of the things I'm going to emphasize is that there's a lot of hermeneutic work to be done. And I like that fancy academic word. It really just means there's a lot of interpretation to be done. Because as this quote from Catherine Delano Smith points out, there is this conceptual problem. Because if we as historians or anthropologists or map makers look back, it's very hard for us to understand pre-literate cultures, this kind of oral state of consciousness. This is something that is very alien to us. And that's something that we still haven't overcome in many ways. So what is indigenous mapping? Well, since a lot has been written about it, I chose kind of a personal definition based on my own experiences of living in cultures all over the world. I lived in Brazil, I was in Ghana, I've been to East Asia, I've lived all over. And what I encountered in many of these different cultures was that there is a distinct way of making sense of the world. So if you're even in a place like Taiwan, which obviously is very developed, there's a very different way of making sense of yourself, your family, your environment, your connections. And then indigenous cartographic systems are evidence of a very old and deep way of human thinking, because it's us and our natural environment. And so these two systems of making sense of the world, of mapping the world, in the indigenous worldview, that's again very different from our modern view, what really defines it is this kind of lateral and associative thinking. So it's not a kind of causal thinking, it's this looking at things through lateral and associations. And I will give you examples of that. And it's also an intuitive sense of understanding. So it's not necessarily reducing things, experimenting with things. It's looking at things through an intuitive sense of place and time. And what's interesting is that these indigenous systems, which sound very mysterious or mystical, and the scientific systems, actually all of these exist in the psyche of all human beings, because we've all experienced the world intuitively, laterally, associatively, and then we've all experienced the world, in the West scientifically. I had a student who insisted that we're all rational beings and we examine everything intuitively. And I asked him a very simple question. I said, how did you pick your girlfriend? And I said, I assure you, it was not through a series of deductive reasoning. And that kind of broke him open to other kinds of thinking. So these two images are kind of the core of what I want to talk about here, how I would define, in quotes, modern cultures versus indigenous or traditional cultures. And it's kind of an arbitrary list, but it's through observations of my own a lot and reading as well. And I think it's very important for people to understand this, because there's a lot of conflict that we have difficulty describing because we don't understand the two mindsets at work. So in modern cultures, part of it is just the pursuit of modernism in all its forms. Everything has to be modern. Medicine has to be modern. Education has to be modern. Mapping has to be modern. And our view of the other is kind of pejorative, right? That culture is not modern, they're backwards. Or sometimes we have this kind of perverse thing of the noble savage, which has been going on since the Enlightenment, when we look at indigenous cultures. In modern cultures, we also have formal scientific methods, we have rigid classification systems for the natural world, and a particular thing which I have a strong bias against, but exists a lot in our culture, particularly in the United States, is scientism. So not just science, but scientism, that everything is reducible. The reductionist view can be applied to everything from child raising to political culture, et cetera. And there's this drive for everything to be considered in terms of laws and grand unified theories. In fact, I wrote a book completely not about cartography, but about the philosophy of physics, and I talk about this idea. Now, if we look by contrast at indigenous or traditional cultures, we see, again, the opposite. We see an unawareness or lack of interest in modernity. And by lack of interest, I've been in places, it's quite interesting, where Westerners have come, missionaries, development people, try to impose this value system. And there's not rejection, there's simply cognitive dissonance. There's not interest in it. It's not needed. You also see in indigenous cultures the use of knowledge from observation, certainly, but also there's a belief in revealed knowledge, sacred knowledge. There's some classification, but a lot of times knowledge is arranged according to principles of homology, which I'll give you an example of later, et cetera. And also you see, instead of reductionism, you see a holistic view of the world. Everything counts. It's not just me, it's me in the environment. It's the environment and its relationship to the heavens, to the celestial configuration. Everything has to be considered together, and there's no direction. Everything is holistic, circular, et cetera, or perhaps everything is still in stasis. So again, a very, very different worldview. In the West, we have standardization. If you're a map person, you understand this. There's sense of scale and units of measurement. We use data to draw conclusions. We insist that things be testable, repeatable, peer-reviewed, et cetera. We reject anything that's not observable, right? If I can't measure it in a laboratory, it doesn't exist. And then knowledge is held by specialized individuals, people like Ron Grimm that have degrees in this stuff, right? And we have formal credentialing system. And then in indigenous systems, by contrast, we have standardization, but it's local. It's the community's rules. It's the community's rituals. We test things in an indigenous culture. Certainly, for example, herbal medications, people don't take things at random, but we don't have a system of peer review. And any data we have includes oral information, what's called performative and narrative knowledge, folk knowledge is all included in the corpus of knowledge. And it's transmitted in a way that is not connected to universities or formal learning in the modern sense. Also, non-observable causes are accepted. There is divine intervention. There's the spirit world. And you find this even in very modern cultures such as Taiwan. I noticed this in Japan. There's a belief in kami or shen, different kinds of spirits. And then knowledge is held not necessarily by people with a PhD, thank God, but also people who have specialized individual credentials, such as shamans and priests, etc. So a very different set of standards. So here's an example. This was a wonderful example that was lent to me by a South African artist, actually a white Boer South African artist. And he was fascinated by this. And I actually used this in one of my books. And he took an indigenous plant and he just put in his artwork 2 written descriptions. The one on the left is the indigenous description, and the one on the right is the Western description. And it's this kind of medicinal plant that was studied scientifically. It has a Latin name, Drimia robusta, and then it has an indigenous name and an indigenous description. And if you look at these are very, very different. So one looks at this principle of homology. The plant is red, it's red like blood. Because it's red like blood, therefore it's connected with women's sexuality. It has some kind of efficacious quality to it. And this is classic indigenous thinking. You find this in Chinese medicine, you find this in African ethnobotany, etc. And then the Western view on the right-hand side, it's this examination of physical appearance. And then, in fact, this contains certain chemicals they found out that do, in fact, have some physiological effect. But to the artist and to me, this is not important. What's important is that he places these side by side, that they have equal valence. They are equal ways of interpreting the world. And I say this without any sort of leftist bias or political correctness. This is the way human beings are. They look at the world from very different perspectives, and both perspectives are active, useful ways of engaging the environment. Both of them work. So this is a great example of the difference. Again, analytical and reductionist on the right, and then lateral, associative, and homologous on the left. And so if we look at mapping, we can see that mapping traditions follow the same breakdown. At some point, tens of thousands of years ago, there was an original sense of orientation in the landscape. It was just us, men and women in the landscape. And yet we evolved 2 very different ways of thinking, an analytical, scientific cartographic tradition, and then a non-analytical kind of indigenous system, which lasted obviously from the past into the present. So these 2 systems evolved. They're both productive, they both work, but they're both very different. So we can see an example of this again. Here's a map. This is a map from the 18th century, and it uses the standards of longitude, toponymy, topography. It's something that we all are familiar with. There's a scale on the border, etc. It's static, it's standardized. It doesn't need an explainer. I can pick it up after 100, 200 years, and I can understand what it is saying to me. And even we see the person who made this map even was analytical, looking at the indigenous culture that did it, trying to find ethnographic types. It's like a classic 19th century analytical way of viewing the world cartographically and anthropologically. Now, what's interesting then, of course, is to look at a parallel example, which is non-analytical. This is a piece of indigenous cartography, which many of you may be familiar with. These are the stick charts from the Marshall Islands. And I think one of these is in the Library of Congress, at least one of them is. And what's interesting is these are cartographical works. So these are humans engaging with nature, but there's no use of scale, and it's dynamical rather than static. What it's looking at, this one in particular, is looking at ocean swells and currents. And this was useful because somebody navigating in the oceans, this is an active piece of cartography, would know that an island was near because the swells would change. And you can detect this far, far away from an island when you're out in the Pacific. So notice, again, it's equally valid. It has the same valence. It's doing a slightly different job, but it's an active way of engaging the world and comes from the same psyche as that other, very plain rectangular map. Here's an in-between example. So here we have the 13th century itinerary map from Matthew of Paris. And what's interesting is, again, is what is its purpose? How is it engaging the world? Well, there's a very interesting quote that someone wrote about this map. And the quote runs, as you can see, accuracy, like realism, was not beyond the abilities of the map maker. It was beside the point. This map was not meant as a travel aid. It was meant to substitute for a real religious voyage by enabling imagined pilgrimage for monks cloistered in their remote abbey. So notice it's non-analytical in the sense that, again, accuracy, like realism, was not beyond the abilities of the map maker. It was besides the point. So there are ways of engaging the world cartographically that do other things besides mapping. Maybe it tells a story. Maybe it brings us to a place. Maybe it engages us in a dynamic navigation of the ocean. They're doing different things, but with full validity. So this is the non-analytic tradition. And since I'm talking today about the sort of psychological foundations behind this, I can give you some other examples. So here's another example of a non-analytic mode, a non-analytic way of engaging the world. Acupuncture, which some of you may have had. Acupuncture is a cartography of the human body with acupuncture charts serving the same function as a map. But it's a strange map because it's non-analytical in the sense that there is no causal connection from our Western perspective between these points and lines in the body and the locations of actual organs, right? So there are these meridian lines, but they don't necessarily correspond to the heart and lungs and liver, etc. So this is a very strange way of looking at the world. And again, here's a map of the human body, right? And it has lines, and the lines are mapped, and this has been done for hundreds of years, but there is not a correspondence to place in our sense. And in fact, if we look at a typical acupuncture chart of the ear, we see the acupuncture points, and they're for all over the place: the heel, the toes, the ankle, the hip joint, the lower abdomen, et cetera, the butt, the colon, the bladder. So what does this tell us? Well, it's a very interesting form of cartography because there's no specific geographical correspondence between these acupuncture points and the body, but there is this indigenous trait, again, we see correlative principles. So you get acupuncture at this point in your ear to fix your hip. Well, how can that be? Well, because in this system, they're correlated. And this is why I say it's a very different mindset. It's a mindset that's alien to us. When I actually happen to have a hip injury from martial arts, and you go to a Western doctor and they're taking MRIs of your hip. You go to the Chinese doctor and he's sticking needles in your ear and also the back of your head, because it's a completely different model of the human body, and it's a different model of pain and injuries, etc. So very good example of indigenous thinking. We see this in herbal medicine. We see this in herbal medicine, not just in the Chinese system, but I've also seen this in West Africa, where it's based again on correlative principles. In fact, the application of the Chinese pharmacopoeia, the drugs that Chinese use, the herbal medications, are all based on principles of affinity, not causality. So the various human organs, the lungs, large intestine, stomach, spleen, etc., are categorized according to certain qualities, and hence treatment for those organs is also categorized according to these 5 flavors, in quotes, for the different herbal drugs. So you could have an illness that was a heat illness, and so that would be affecting your lungs or your large intestine. You have problems with digestion, and that's connected to the fundamental element of metal. And so you would take ginger to tonify, to readjust that balance. And you have these different qualities, flavors, valences in different amounts in your body, and Chinese herbal medicine is always trying to balance it or create some kind of tonifying, healthy state for you. And you notice, in the West, ancient Greek and medieval medical theory had the same thing. They had the 4-element theory of earth, air, fire, and water. But that disappeared after the time of Harvey, and in the 17th and 18th century, that disappeared. And contemporary medical practice, again, is reductionist and causal. There are causal agents, there's bacteria, there's viruses, etc. Those cause illnesses. We must defeat those to make the body healthy again. So why am I talking about this? Well, again, because the point is, it's not just different ways of treating, it's entirely different models of viewing the body, just like we have entirely different models of viewing the landscape. So if you have different models of viewing things, you have different operating systems. You engage those different environments in 2 different ways. Now, I've mentioned a couple times that I'm not particularly politically correct, but I believe that each of these systems has very strong integrity and worth. And you notice, for example, in the case of acupuncture and herbal medicine, that they have very long lineage, thousands of years. They are still used and taught. But most importantly to me, the fact is, again, they are based on models. They're models that may be alien to us, but they're models with their own internal logic. And this is something, I used to be a professor, and I would always explain to students that you have to look at things within their own frames of reference, be it the Christian religion or Islam or an indigenous belief system or an indigenous medical practice or ancient maps, that there is the model and the engagement with the model that's entirely self-referential. And the problem is we just sometimes can't get into that mental framework. So again, these are characteristics of indigenous or traditional knowledge systems in anything from medicine to mapping. The long lineage continue to be used and taught. And again, they include a model of the world and the methods for engaging that model of the world. So a last example, which again gets us back to mapping, is Feng Shui, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. Feng Shui, for those of you who don't know, the characters are actually very simple. Feng just means wind, and Shui means water. And there's no real translation. Sometimes it's called geomancy in technical studies. And it's a practice that's still very common all throughout Asia. And it's a practice based on what are called di mai. That's the characters below. And this literally means earth arteries. So it's funny that the earth, the landscape, is viewed as a living entity like a human body that has these meridians through which energy flows. And again, we had this in the West. If any of you are interested in sort of Anglo-Saxon history and things like Stonehenge and witchcraft and all that kind of stuff, those cultures, the Celtic cultures, And Anglo-Saxon cultures generally had ley lines, L-E-Y, ley lines, which is exactly the same principle as Feng Shui, but it's just very remote for us, obviously, whereas Feng Shui is still a living system. And what's interesting, again, is here you have an indigenous system that fulfills that criteria of being correlative. It's based on this idea of connecting meridians rather than some kind of rationalizing reductionism. And in fact, in one style of Feng Shui, you pick an auspicious site, and that site is determined in relation to the local topography, the mountains, the water, the valleys, etc., compass directions. But again, it's correlative. It's not done through a series of reducing down to a particular set of facts, like we're going to build here because it's not a floodplain, or we're going to build here because it's sheltered from the wind. Because in fact, when you look at the environment of a particular site, the examination is not limited to the topography. It also includes astronomical influences. And again, we see the principle of holism then. So what's interesting is that the earth then, and the cartography of the earth is active. This is a living landscape. So we see that dynamic quality again. In the earth is this qi, this life force, just like in Chinese medicine, in the body there's qi. And so again, we have knowledge that is, not really reducible or directly observable, but somehow the Feng Shui master can observe the qi, this transcendent abstract thing, and can map it. And because we have qi and the earth has qi, according to this model, then we can place the person. And so what's interesting is, again, it's a classic example of an indigenous system. It associates everything into this holistic approach. So in Feng Shui, you're mapping the landscape, but also your position within the landscape, where you're going to live. Also when, because when you build a building is determined by the principles of Feng Shui. And then the whole point of it is to create harmony between human daily life and the environment. And traditionally, Feng Shui was also about the proper placement of buildings, but more completely, the goal was, and still is as practiced, to situate one's built environment and oneself with these patterns of qi that flow through the earth. So it's a really wonderful example of an indigenous way of thinking, being associative and being holistic. All right, so let's wrap up here. All of this, I would conjecture, is based on some deep psychological substructures. And to me, it is very interesting to ask the original human sense of our orientation in the landscape. What was that like 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 years ago? Now we have these two traditions, the analytical tradition and then the non-analytical indigenous tradition, and that second tradition that may still incorporate some of this stuff from our original psyche in relationship to the environment. And it's very interesting because then we begin to reflect that human beings do have this deep component of relational thinking, correlative thinking, holistic thinking, dynamic thinking. We work on principles of homomorphism, things that look similar. Again, the plant is red like blood, and therefore it must be efficacious in things having to do with the blood. Another example of that, by the way, is ginger. The ginger root looks like a human being. And so in Chinese medicine, it's considered as being very powerful because homomorphically, it looks like the thing that it is treating. You have all kinds of principles like this, macro and micro. So you find this in Kabbalism. You find this in palm reading. So the hand is a micro version of life itself with a lifeline. So, the audience is pretty big tonight, and there are people who will look at that kind of thinking and say, oh, it's ridiculous, or they'll say, oh, that's fascinating, or oh, I didn't know it. That's not important. What's important is that it exists. It's something very, very deep within our psyche. And we see evidence of it all the time in all kinds of things. Historically, of course, again, human beings tend to incorporate both ways of thinking. So as a little sidebar here of some maps, it's interesting that just the layout of cities shows you how human beings are always in this kind of synthesis and dissonance of the inorganic, analytical, rigid systems and the organic, indigenous, non-analytical modes. So we see, for example, my hometown of Philadelphia, this rigid Quaker grid that, of course, as the city develops, it totally breaks down. Or the map above, I think that's actually the city of Belo Horizonte, where there's a big cartography conference. And boy, that was an example of a 19th century rigid and even, in fact, racist delineation of the perfect modern city. And then that also became very chaotic through time. And as all these organic neighborhoods, and you see this over and over, where the city of London, where there's not even an attempt to be sort of rigid and rational, it just is an aggregate of thousands of years of people just walking in different paths. And you have what are called affordances, routes that are just the most convenient place to go. So maps can very clearly show the human struggle to have both of these things competing back and forth or coexisting in their psyche. All right, so to wrap up, what are then the kind of psychological substructures of this? Well, analytical thinking really comes from a kind of foundational culture and the psychology behind that culture. So blame the Greeks, okay? Because when we look at our culture deriving from Greek culture, Plato in particular, we see there's this idea of a kind of fixed, eternal, transcendent realm. Plato calls it the idoi, the ideals. And that's the anchor point or foundation for understanding. And this enters everything, even our political dialogue. Are the Democrats right or the Republicans right? And who's going to win? And what's the correct system? What's justice? So this kind of fixation on fixed ideals that's so deep in the Western psyche comes from this foundational system. Now, what's the contrast to that? Well, the non-analytical thinking comes from a non-foundational culture, which is this kind of associative lateral quality that's in our psyche as well. That's holistic, relational. Reality is ever changing. There is no anchor point or foundation for understanding. If you read Confucius, his Analects, you see that he emphasizes this kind of relational system without a fixed right or wrong. And I've often taught this. I use these very simple diagrams. Particularly, I've done consulting where I'm trying to explain how to understand East Asian culture for business people. And I said, the West, this is us on the left. You have this hierarchy of a fixed ideal, and then the society and individuals down coming from that. So when someone down here feels that they've been wronged or needs a point of reference, they go up the ladder and appeal to the Supreme Court, or they go up and they seek some fixed reference point on a map or in an encyclopedia. And then we can compare that to this non-analytical system that is associative, dynamic, and you find this in Confucius thinking, in Taoist thinking, in indigenous thinking, where everything is relational, and I maintain relations with my family and friends, and I determine what's right or wrong by looking at what immediately are the effects in my neighborhood. And if you've ever lived in an indigenous culture, you find that they even have words for these things. So one of my favorite was in Brazil. It's called jeitinho, which basically means the little way. So if you have a problem, you get the friend of a friend or the cousin of your best friend's sister's brother to sort things out. And if you're from Philadelphia, everything works in Philadelphia this way too. But this is a classic example, again, of an indigenous way of seeing yourself in the world. And it's very different from the system on the left. So to conclude, To me, it's fascinating, again, if we consider the original human sense of orientation in the landscape and with each other. And how can we return to that state of mind? There's a lot of fascination with this now, particularly among young people. I had students who are obsessed with taking, what's it called, ayahuasca, which is this Central American hallucinogen. And they were interested in it because for those peoples, it's a way to relate in this lateral associative way to their environment. But how might we return to that state of mind naturally, looking at maps, thinking about other ways of mapping? And I would argue, to take, some side here, that something has been lost perhaps in our modern way of mapping and our relationship to the environment. And if we look through time, we see that we've moved from our Neolithic period, when we just interacted with the landscape itself and told stories about it, to indigenous maps, where there's a separation. We are mapping the other, the thing. And then we move from that to scientific maps, which means that we have to reduce things, we have to exclude things, we have to reify things. And then we move from that to handheld devices and looking at maps, they're not even really maps, on our phone, which is an even further remove from any kind of sense of place and landscape in the broad sense. So each step in our intellectual engagement with the environment is a further remove from the landscape itself. So I want to end with this wonderful quote. This is from a guy named Stanner, who was an Australian anthropologist who worked in the outback. And he says, man, society, and nature, and past, present, and future are at one together within a unitary system of such a kind that its ontology, its sense of being, cannot illuminate minds too much under the influence of humanism, rationalism, and science. So Stanner is saying, like, we in our present state cannot understand this because we are so infused with humanistic, analytical thinking, rationalism, and science. And he says, therefore, one cannot easily, in the mobility of modern life and thought, in modern thinking, again, grasp the vast intuitions of stability and permanence of life and mankind at the heart of Aboriginal ontology. That is this indigenous way of being. It's very, very remote to us, which is fascinating. So I'm very interested in this. I'm still doing research on this. I may be writing a paper for the Portal Land. For those of you who are interested, I'll be writing a little bit deeper about this. And there's a lot of work to be done about when this split took place in our psyche, and if there's any records of that in the sort of great thinkers of human history. So I'm open to questions. I want to thank you very much. I hope that was of interest. I think Ron or someone else is going to field the questions and pass them on to me.
Yes. Thanks, Ben. I'm not quite sure what to ask at this point, but I just want to say I feel like we've expanded our horizons about how we think about space and mapping.
And I know a bunch of people wrote questions in the chat, so I'm happy to
Okay,
address
let me
whatever.
get back here to the beginning. Okay. Okay. Nick Canas, given their emphasis on symbols, appealing to emotion and scale variation, would you put pictorial maps in the indigenous camp? They really don't come from non-Western culture roots, but exist to emphasize a point. For example, promoting tourism and making a political statement. Do indigenous maps try to do the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, again, pictorial maps and things that are trying to make a point, why do they work? Because they are appealing to our emotional sense. And so the very fact that they are not rational is what makes them so attractive. So yeah, they are like indigenous maps because they're appealing to that part of our mind. that indigenous intuitive part of our mind. I mean, and I don't want to talk about politics, but that's how all politics works nowadays. It's trying to grab you on that level, not in your high rational level. So yes, absolutely to that question.
Okay, Thomas Paper. If a non-analytical model like acupuncture is correlative, is it possible that a scientific approach, just a minute,
Will someday. Will
Yeah.
someday.
will someday explain and determine the causality of the practice of acupuncture?
Yes, and I should say I chose the acupuncture example because I've done work in the history of medicine. Yes, but what's interesting is, and when I presented on this, it's like what I said, they may find someday in the Western framework that sticking a needle here really does have some connection through the human nervous system to such and such organ. But what I say is, why do we have to care about that? Like, why can't we understand there's just a different model with a different way of looking at things, and it has its efficacy within that model? So the answer is yes, and people have absolutely written on that. There's German studies of that in particular, but I always want to make clear that we have to be wary that everything has to be validated in a Western sense. And this is weird coming from me, as I say, because I'm not like a hippie lefty, but I think things should always be understood in their own context. So you're absolutely right, what you said. And as I said, there are great references to that, which I'm happy to send you. But I want to make my point about the model and the thinking within the model. I see you smiling, but I hope I'm clear.
No, look, I agree. And you don't have to do the next question if you don't, Ron, because it's more about the same. But I do hope you can address the subconscious and Jung and dreams, because I feel like there's some relationship of all of that into what you're talking about here, things that just can't be explained, but that are important to humans.
Well, I mean, this is a huge part. So if anyone, is interested in Freud and Jung, Freud was the epitome of the Western analytical reductionist mode of thinking. And he and Jung were colleagues and friends, and they had a split. And why do they have the split? Because Jung believed that the indigenous mind had a lot to offer. And Jung said, it's clear from looking at dreams and the unconscious that, boy, we are definitely still in that world, right? That's how and in the paper that hopefully will be in the Portal Land, I have this great quote from Jung, because Jung wrote one of his last books on UFOs, believe it or not, because Jung lived a long time into the 1960s. And he wrote, what is belief in UFOs? It's our weird medieval associative superstitious mind still at work. And he said, that's cool. We just need to be honest that that's what exists. So absolutely, the unconscious is a kind of everyday reminder that that's all in there, right? And, an example you can use that I'm careful about using is children, that if you have a kid, you see kids think associatively, correlatively, they engage in magical thinking. You can't use that example publicly because it has associations for people that you're calling indigenous groups childlike, which is very problematic. So I avoid using that typically. But to me, it's just a wonderful example of our inner nature, a very powerful nature. So yes, absolutely to the subconscious, unconscious and Jung, without any doubt whatsoever.
Okay, Joseph Cubble. Isn't the trend of GIS a step to be more conclusive versus the reductionism that was present in paper mapping?
Well, I mean, GIS, the very name, the term is about informational system. I mean, you are trying to avoid reductionism by getting more information, but the fact that it's a system shows that there's, again, this kind of modernistic approach of a universal standard to which we must all obey. And so even as it includes more information, it's like the internet, it also reduces the way in which we are allowed to engage the world. It says the only ways that include certain kinds of information, text, certain kind of visual standards, certain kind of numerical coordinates. So yes, it's more encompassing, but I have to use the fancy word, its modality is very limiting. So it's still reductionist. Anything modern is going to be reductionist because you need the modern tools and the modern language to engage it. So good question. Great questions.
Jeff Katz, how would you consider the role of prayer in modern culture?
I pray every day at this point. Well, again, you see, particularly in the United States, more so than in Europe, where I also lived, plenty of people are religious, plenty of people pray because people believe in non-material forces at work. And my wife, who's a Buddhist, I mean, a real Buddhist, because she's Asian, she believes in this very much. I always use her as an example because she's an accountant and she's a CPA, but then she goes to the Buddhist temple and does what's called in Chinese bye-bye, to pray to the ancestors. So absolutely, again, it shows that we incorporate both these things and they cause us an enormous amount of stress because we believe in something transcendent or spiritual, and then our culture tells us, well, that's wrong. And we're caught in this very dissonant phase of our history right now. So absolutely, it's relevant. We're modern, but we're not modern. And that's okay. That's, again, what Jung said. So.
Okay, Eleanor Bigelow, is the invention of the internet moving society back towards an indigenous model versus the hierarchical model of authority?
Good question. And I mentioned the internet in passing, so let me be more specific. The internet, many people saw that, and Zoom, right, as a way of kind of bringing us back to this tribal culture where we can associate and we can work laterally, et cetera. But remember, the internet has at least two qualities that are still modern and therefore problematic in my view. One is that it's mediated, right, by technology, by capitalism, et cetera, not to sound like a Marxist. But the other, if anyone's looked at the internet, there is no, how can I put this? There is no priesthood of the internet in a good way. So anything goes. All things have equal status. So a website with the most crazy junk is equal to a website that Ron Grimm put together based on years of research, right? So what's the indigenous analogy? Well, even in indigenous cultures, there is a priesthood that carefully preserves important, relevant knowledge and has a ritual for engaging people in that knowledge. The internet has none of that. You have a laptop, you have a phone, God forbid, and you have an internet connection, you become a priest and a shaman. That's problematic for human cultures, right? Even indigenous cultures do not work on an anything goes basis. So great question. Again.
Okay, next one's more of a comment. Carrie Gordon, wonderful lecture to help us understand how others think, especially those very different from ourselves. By acknowledging this, we can better understand our products. Example, their maps. Bravo, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Let's see, there are a couple more here. There are several more here. Ivan Jurin. Did P.S. Buck actually write life in an indigenous world view in the good earth? A first for American readers and moviegoers.
Yeah, I've never read Pearl S. Buck. I probably should. I think that was the idea of the book, to sort of look at a kind of indigenous way of living. But I have not read the book, so I can't say. Certainly there are many other people that have, sought this. I mean, Lawrence of Arabia, a guy who wrote a book called Alone in the Wilderness, which many of you may have seen on PBS, where the guy builds the cabin in Alaska with his own hands. This is the kind of crowd that should see that if you haven't. So I don't know. I have not read Pearl S. Buck. I'm ashamed to say. So.
Okay. Graham Birchall. I notice that many young people cannot use a traditional paper map. They are not able to comprehend the symbols. They are instead dependent on their smartphone. Okay, just a minute. Giving them directions. To me, it feels like such people are becoming non-modern. Comments?
Yeah, it's tricky. These things are tricky. It's like the internet question. Like on the face of it, you would think that young people are returning to this sort of, pre-modern way because they function with these phones and they move in little tribes. But it's deceiving, because I think what's actually happening is that they're being atomized. So they're not becoming non-modern. What they're becoming is just dissolute, right? To become non-modern, they would have to devise their own systems for engaging in the world. There was something a number of years ago, which was funny. There was a movement among young people called Going Amish, where they discarded their phones and they just went out and did stuff in the real world. What's it called? IRL, in real life. So yeah, I think young people, it's deceiving to think that the smartphone and their independence with this is making them like indigenous people. It's not, because again, they're using something that's created thousands of miles away in a corporate structure, in a technology that they can't fix or manipulate themselves. So it's a false indigeneity, I would say.
Okay, we're several minutes past the hour, but let's do one more question. And I apologize to the people I haven't reached. Judy Bach, I'm wondering if we all are a composite of the traditional and non-traditional, i.e. we have and use non-traditional mental maps that can be represented in cartographic and or non-traditional representations. But we also learn, understand, and use formal traditional cartographic systems, so we have a common map language. And then it's our cultural that places value and emphasis on one way or the other, a learned way of thinking.
Yeah, this is, I'd say this question is even trickier than it seems. It's a very good question, because I predict that last line, it's our culture that places value and emphasis on one way or the other. So it's kind of learned way of thinking. That yes, everything around us comes from, inside our heads. We haven't used, as the writer says, non-traditional mental maps, but we also learn and understand formal systems. So the question is, why do certain cultures end up emphasizing one and not the other, or one at the expense of others? And, this is very complicated. Just as a brief aside, there's a whole series of books now. There's one by Pinker, there's another by a guy named Harari called Sapiens. There are all these books now about the history of human civilization. And it's directly addressing this question, Judy's question, about how did we end up making certain choices and emphases? And I don't think anybody knows, why modernity happened is a huge mystery. I have my own theory, which I'm not going to expound here, but this is kind of a hot topic right now. So it's impossible to answer. But yes, there's some kind of cultural reinforcement and value judgment that made us be here today in this system.
And I'd like to thank you. And on behalf of the Washington Map Society, I have two gifts for you. I see some people applauding. So yes, we applaud your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, but this first one is what's called a cut line map of Philadelphia.
Cool.
And I think that probably represents our scientific tradition.
Cool. And it's a Philly, so.
Yeah, well, and then there's a company here in Washington, D.C. who does these artistic maps of cities.
Oh, awesome.
Called Territory. And so this is Philadelphia as well, but I think this is more probably on your indigenous level.
Cool. Thank you very much. That's very nice of you. And yeah, for those of you who don't know, I'm Philly born and raised, so thank you.
So F12 makes it louder, F11 makes it louder.
Thank
Okay,
you very John
Okay.
and Ron, thank you very much
I
for
think it's
hosting
Ryan.
me.
Click F12.
Okay, we can now open it up for a little socializing if
Up row.
people want to maybe ask a few further questions.